Pam Bondi fined Karoline Leavitt, confident that she had solid grounds. But when Karoline began defending herself, Pam realized, she was not just a violator, but a legal genius capable of turning the case in her favor. What happened next made everyone in the courtroom fall silent and changed someone's life forever. But before we continue, let's find out where you're from. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story just for you. Pam Bondi sat in her office, reviewing documents for yet another case. It was a routine administrative fine. Karoline Leavitt was accused of violating one of the regulations related to election campaigns. Pam had no doubts, her team had checked everything, the evidence was solid. The case seemed straightforward, not worth any extra attention. The fine was signed and sent. But a few days later, a notification landed on her desk. Karoline Leavitt had officially filed a protest. Pam smirked. Predictable. But when she glanced at the materials submitted by Karoline, her confidence wavered, just slightly. Pam Bondi was accustomed to cases like this. The people she fined usually followed the same pattern. They showed up with an uncertain lawyer, tried to justify themselves, referenced some technicalities, but in the end, they either walked out with a reduced fine or simply accepted the ruling. She expected something similar from Karoline Leavitt. Young, ambitious, but inexperienced, that's how people in the legal circles described her. Pam prepared for a standard process, ask a few clarifying questions, set a couple of tricky traps, push Karoline into admitting her mistake, and close the case. But the moment Karoline walked into the courtroom, Pam felt something was off. Karoline stepped in confidently, her posture impeccable, her gaze focused. She didn't look like someone about to plead for leniency. On the contrary, there was a quiet confidence in her movements, even a hint of defiance. Pam's eyes quickly scanned her. Karoline wore a sharp navy blue suit, tailored perfectly, exuding professionalism. No unnecessary emotions, no hesitation. She carried herself as if she already knew how this case would end. She came well prepared, Pam noted to herself, but quickly brushed the thought aside. Court is now in session, the judge's voice rang out. Prosecution, please present your case. Pam stood up. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Karoline Leavitt violated election campaign financing regulations, as evidenced by the supporting documents. She opened a folder, displaying the paperwork to the judge. According to Section 134.2 of the election law, the use of opaque funds for campaign financing is grounds for an administrative fine. In this case, the fine amounts to $250,000. Pam shifted her gaze to Karoline, expecting at least a flicker of concern. But Karoline simply nodded calmly. Your Honor, may I present my defense? Go ahead, Miss Leavitt. Karoline stood up, picked up her folder, opened it, and at that moment, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Thank you, Karoline began. First, let me clarify that the law cited by the prosecution does indeed regulate campaign financing. However, she paused, letting the room hold its breath. In this particular case, the law does not apply. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Pam frowned. Explain, the judge said firmly. Karoline was in no hurry. She turned a page in her folder. This regulation applies strictly to federal elections. My campaign, however, was registered at the state level. Pam felt irritation rising within her. She began, but Karoline cut her off. And now, allow me to cite the Supreme Court's official interpretation from 2021. She pulled out a document and began reading. The financing of state-level election campaigns does not fall under the jurisdiction of the federal election law, provided that the funds originate from sources compliant with state legislation. Karoline looked up. Your Honor, my campaign was funded exclusively by legal state sources. Therefore, Miss Bondi's case is built on a misapplication of the law. Pam felt the first crack in her confidence. The judge adjusted her glasses and studied the document. The courtroom fell silent. "Miss Bondi, do you have any objections?" Pam quickly flipped through her papers. She couldn't let Karoline seize control. "I believe Miss Leavitt is exploiting a legal loophole," she stated firmly. Karoline raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing. "This is not a loophole but an accurate application of the law," the judge interjected. Pam felt a sharp sting of frustration. "Damn, this girl is sharp." Furthermore, Karoline continued, "according to this very ruling, fines in such cases may be contested and even fully annulled." She turned her gaze to Pam. "Therefore, the $250,000 fine is not only unjustified but also unlawful." Pam felt her assistant, sitting beside her, tense up. "We need time to verify this," he whispered. But there was no time. Pam took a deep breath. "Your Honor, if permitted, I would like to request additional time to review these new circumstances." The judge nodded. "The hearing is adjourned until tomorrow. I expect final arguments from both sides." Karoline gathered her documents and left the courtroom. Pam watched her closely. Back in her office, Pam threw the folder onto her desk and sank into her chair. "She outplayed us," her assistant admitted. Pam pressed her lips together. "Not yet," she said firmly. "But that girl, she's a legal genius." Pam couldn't sleep. She combed through the documents again and again, and the more she read the laws, the more she realized, Karoline truly knew what she was doing. "Damn it," Pam muttered under her breath. She had to find a way to turn the situation around. The next morning, before heading to court, Pam looked at her reflection in the mirror. "All right," she thought. "If I can't beat her head-on, I'll have to change the strategy." Today, she would play by a different set of rules. The next day, Pam Bondi arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. She had spent the night rereading the law, searching for any possible way to counterattack. But even after hours of analysis, she found nothing that could definitively refute Karoline Leavitt's arguments. "It's impossible that I missed something," Pam thought as she flipped through documents in the hallway outside the courtroom. But there was no more time for doubt. As the doors to the courtroom opened and the judge took their seat, the proceedings resumed. Karoline once again took her place at the defense table. Her expression remained calm, confident, perhaps even slightly smug. She knew this was her day. Pam pressed her lips together. "Let's see who comes out victorious." Karoline was the first to speak. "Your Honor," she began, "I would like to reference another section of the law that fully supports my position." She pulled out a folder and placed it in front of the judge. According to Section 78.3 of the Election Code, a fine can only be imposed if campaign funds come from illegal sources. However, as I have already demonstrated, my donors are registered at the state level and fully comply with legal requirements. The judge nodded while reviewing the document. Pam felt her assistant tense beside her. "We didn't check that section," he whispered. "Obviously," Pam replied quietly. But Karoline wasn't done. Moreover, she continued, "Miss Bondi's case contains a critical error. The documents she is relying on are outdated. The data presented in court is from the previous quarter, not the current reporting period." A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. "Damn it." Pam quickly stood up. "Your Honor, even if we take the defense's argument into account, the issue of financial transparency remains unresolved." Karoline crossed her arms. "Miss Bondi, are you claiming that my campaign financing is non-transparent?" Pam narrowed her eyes slightly. "I am stating that your financing requires further investigation." Karoline smiled. "If that's the case, why has my campaign already been audited 3 times without finding any violations?" Pam felt the judge turn toward her. "Miss Bondi, do you have any evidence that further investigation is necessary?" Pam knew she didn't. At this moment, she had nothing but her instincts. Not at this time, but... Then your statement is a supposition, not a legal fact, Karoline interrupted calmly. Pam clenched her jaw. Karoline pressed forward. Your Honor, I formally request that the imposed fine not only be deemed unlawful but also be recognized as a violation of my electoral rights. Pam's head shot up. She's going all in. The judge paused. I will make a final ruling after reviewing all materials. But, Miss Bondi, you must consider that your arguments are currently unconvincing. Pam knew she was losing. But at that moment, there was a knock on the courtroom door. The clerk entered and handed Pam an envelope. This is urgent correspondence for you, Miss Bondi. Pam tore open the envelope and began reading. After a few seconds, a faint smile touched her lips. There it is. She looked up at the judge. Your Honor, I would like to present new evidence. Karoline frowned. We were not notified of any new evidence. Because it has just arrived. The judge gestured for Pam to continue. Pam spread out the documents before her. The donors listed in Miss Leavitt's records are indeed legally registered. However, she paused, allowing the anticipation in the room to build. One of these donors was under federal investigation for potential fraud at the time of the donation. Karoline froze. That's a lie, she said, but for the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in her voice. Pam smiled. You're welcome to verify the records. Federal agents are currently investigating your donor for a series of illicit financial transfers. Karoline hadn't expected this. The judge took the documents. These are serious allegations. I cannot issue a final ruling until a thorough review is conducted. Karoline opened her mouth to object, but Pam already knew, she had seized the initiative. This hearing is adjourned, the judge announced. Karoline clenched her fists. She had thought she had already won. But now, everything had changed again. As Pam left the courtroom, she felt the first real taste of victory. But she knew this wasn't over yet. The next day, the courtroom was filled with journalists, political analysts, and even representatives from other legal teams. The intrigue surrounding the Pam Bondi versus Karoline Leavitt case had spread quickly through professional circles. Pam sat at the prosecution table, carefully watching Karoline. She knew Karoline wouldn't back down. After Pam had introduced unexpected evidence about the suspicious donor, Karoline had only one option left, to dismantle its credibility. The judge entered the room, and the proceedings resumed. Miss Leavitt, do you have any comments regarding the evidence presented yesterday? Karoline stood up calmly. Yes, Your Honor. I have thoroughly reviewed the documents submitted by the prosecution and discovered an interesting detail. She slowly approached the judge's bench and unfolded a report. My donor's name does indeed appear in an investigation, but nowhere does it state that he committed a crime. This is merely an assumption. Moreover, Karoline paused, then glanced at Pam. This investigation began 2 weeks before my donation. But here's what matters, at the time the funds were transferred, my donor had not been charged with anything and was not even aware that he was under investigation. The judge frowned. Do you have evidence to support this? Karoline pulled out another document. An official letter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It clearly states that at the time of the donation, no charges had been filed. This means that my donor could not have made an illegal contribution because, legally, he was still clean. Pam felt the tension in the courtroom rise. She's a damn genius. For the first time during the proceedings, Pam felt control slipping from her grasp. She glanced at her team, her assistants looked concerned. We're cornered, she thought. Karoline continued. Therefore, the prosecution no longer has any legal grounds to impose this fine. Furthermore, Karoline paused again, watching Pam's reaction. Miss Bondi used unverified information to issue an administrative penalty. This means that this very case is, in fact, a violation of my rights. Pam felt her chest tighten. Objection, Your Honor. This is not a violation, it's a standard legal procedure. The judge raised a hand. I will determine that. Pam took a deep breath. She knew she was losing ground but wasn't ready to admit defeat just yet. She needed a new move, or Karoline would completely take over the case. Your Honor, I request permission to call a witness who can clarify the situation regarding Miss Leavitt's donor. Karoline narrowed her eyes slightly. And who exactly? A financial auditor who analyzed the fund transfers. He can confirm that the transaction was suspicious. The judge considered this, then nodded. The court calls the witness. A man in a formal suit entered the courtroom. He introduced himself as Thomas Graham, a financial investigations specialist. Mr. Graham, Pam began, did you receive any reports of suspicious transactions related to Miss Leavitt's campaign contributions? Yes, he responded. Karoline crossed her arms. Can you specify which transactions exactly? Graham shifted his gaze to the judge. We noticed that some of the transfers were made through anonymous funds, which always raises concerns. However. He hesitated. However. Karoline prompted. However, none of these transfers were deemed illegal. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Karoline nodded. Thank you, Mr. Graham. No further questions. Pam realized that her last chance to shake the judge's confidence had failed. The judge clasped their hands together and looked at both sides. I have reviewed the presented evidence and heard all arguments. Taking into account that Miss Leavitt's transactions were not found to be illegal and that the prosecution's case was based on unverified assumptions, the court rules, the administrative fine is annulled. Pam felt as if all the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Karoline smiled. Thank you, Your Honor. Then, she turned to Pam and, stepping closer, said quietly. That was a good case. You're strong. Pam clenched her teeth. I'm not used to losing. Karoline smirked slightly. Then you should get used to the fact that I'm not the kind of person who gives up. Pam watched her as she exited the courtroom. Her career had been built on winning cases. But now she had faced someone who could make her question herself. And for the first time in a long while, Pam felt not just frustration, but admiration. Pam Bondi locked herself in her office, ignoring calls and messages. The final hours of the hearing had been a heavy blow. She hadn't just lost, Karoline Leavitt had proven that the fine Pam imposed wasn't just unjustified but potentially illegal. She had lost fair and square. But that didn't make it any easier. Pam cleared her desk of unnecessary papers, leaving only one in front of her, the court's decision. She reread it over and over, hoping to find a loophole, some way to challenge the ruling. But there was nothing. Everything was airtight. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. What now? Pam knew that losing such a high-profile case wouldn't go unnoticed. Journalists, colleagues, political opponents, they were all already discussing her failure. Her phone buzzed. Pam, have you seen the headlines? Came the voice of an old ally. I have. Karoline Leavitt shreds Bondi's arguments in court. People are saying this is a major hit to your reputation. Thanks for the update, Pam replied dryly. She hung up and closed her eyes. So this is how it's going to be. But she couldn't just sit and wait for her reputation to crumble. Pam reopened the case file. She carefully studied every move Karoline had made, her tactics, her strategy, her approach. Karoline played hard, but she played fair. She hadn't used dirty tricks, just the law, precision, and logic. And that was what scared Pam the most. She couldn't accuse Karoline of dishonesty. Karoline was simply smarter. If I can't beat her in court, maybe I need to learn to play by her rules. That thought lingered in her mind. There was a knock at the door. "Miss Bondi, you have a call," her secretary informed her. "Who is it?" "Karoline Leavitt." Pam narrowed her eyes. "Put her through." A second later, Karoline's calm voice came through the receiver. "Pam, I hope you're not too upset." "Depends on why you're calling," Pam responded, keeping her tone controlled. "I have a proposal." Pam smirked. "You just dismantled my case, and now you're offering something." "Exactly." Pam hesitated. "All right, I'm listening." "You're a strong lawyer, Pam," Karoline continued. "But you're used to always being at the top. Maybe it's time to learn a different way to play." Pam tensed slightly. "What are you getting at?" "I want you to work with me." Pam couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're joking." "I'm completely serious. We both know how the system works. Instead of fighting against each other, we could use our skills for something bigger." Pam hesitated. Karoline had been a dangerous opponent, but did she see something more in her, a potential ally? Could Pam even trust her? "Why me?" she finally asked. Karoline chuckled. "Because next time I walk into a courtroom, I'd rather have you beside me than against me." Pam knew that agreeing to Karoline's proposal would mean drastic changes. She had always walked her own path. She was used to fighting, proving her point, standing her ground. Working with Karoline would mean acknowledging her strength. But maybe this wasn't a defeat. Maybe this was an opportunity. She took a deep breath. "If I say yes, what happens next?" "Then we meet in person and discuss it," Karoline replied. Pam bit her lip. "Give me a day to think." "Deal." Karoline hung up. Pam gazed out the window. Something told her this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of something new. Pam Bondi couldn't stop thinking about Karoline's proposal. It was all too strange. Why does she want to work with me? Pam wondered, flipping through documents. They had just been courtroom opponents. Karoline had won, yet instead of reveling in her triumph, she had extended an offer of partnership. Pam wasn't the type to trust people. Especially not those who had outplayed her. But deep down, she knew, Karoline wasn't just a good lawyer, she was a dangerous player. And if she wasn't with her, she'd be against her. The next evening, they met in a small restaurant. Karoline was already seated by the window when Pam walked in. "Glad to see you," Karoline smiled. Pam took the seat across from her. "I'm not sure I want to discuss this," she admitted. Karoline shrugged. "But you came. That means you're considering it." Pam rolled her eyes. "Let's get straight to the point. What do you want?" Karoline leaned forward slightly. "You're a strong lawyer. So am I. Together, we could accomplish more." Pam narrowed her eyes. "You're asking me to work with you?" "Exactly." Pam hesitated. Karoline spoke with confidence, but Pam still had doubts. "I don't work with people I don't trust," she said directly. Karoline nodded. "Trust is something that has to be earned. But think about this, you can stay on the sidelines, or be part of something bigger." Pam considered that. She had always worked alone. But maybe it was time to change the rules. "Fine," she finally said. "I'm willing to try." Karoline smiled. A great choice. Pam realized that from this moment on, everything was about to change. The courtroom was silent. Everyone was waiting for the verdict. The judge, after carefully reviewing the documents, lifted their gaze and announced. "After considering all the presented arguments, the court rules that the administrative fine is annulled. The grounds for its issuance are deemed insufficiently substantiated." Pam Bondi maintained a composed expression, but inside, she was boiling. She had lost. Officially. Legally. Without a single chance for appeal. Karoline Leavitt sat across from her, her gaze just as steady as it had been at the beginning of the hearing. She didn't gloat, didn't display any sense of triumph. She simply nodded, accepting the judge's decision as if it had been expected all along. Pam stacked her papers, straightened her posture, and looked at the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said evenly, masking her disappointment. Karoline, unhurried, gathered her documents, carefully placing them in her folder. She stood and made her way toward the exit. But before leaving, she stopped beside Pam. "That was a good case," Karoline said, not mockingly, just stating a fact. Pam looked at her. "Perhaps," she replied after a brief pause. "But I don't like losing." Karoline gave a small smile. "Then maybe next time, we should be on the same side." Pam remained silent. Karoline didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked out of the courtroom. Pam sat at the table, staring at the documents. That thought wouldn't leave her mind. A few days had passed since the trial. Pam Bondi expected that Karoline Leavitt would be basking in her victory and wouldn't give the case another thought. But when her assistant handed her the phone with an unexpected call, Pam immediately recognized the voice on the other end. "Pam," Karoline said calmly, "I need help with a case. And it seems like you're the only one who can handle it." Pam leaned forward, gripping the phone. "You just tore my case apart in court, and now you're offering me a job." "That's exactly why," Karoline replied. "I want the best." Pam hesitated, trying to figure out if there was some kind of trap hidden in the proposal. "This doesn't sound like you," she finally said. Karoline smirked slightly. "You know I'm not interested in weak opponents. I don't just want to work with you, I want us to set the rules together." Pam considered this. Losing in court had been unpleasant. But the opportunity to work alongside a mind like Karoline's could open new doors. "All right," she finally said. "Let's talk."